Hail and well met, Slayers of Giants. Welcome to Chapter 2 of my serial novel, Tilting at Windmills. Remember, this is a draft. I'll be very grateful for your feedback throughout, so please comment away on whatever platform you're finding this, and become a patron of my Patreon or subscribe to my Substack so you'll get a little reminder each week when a new chapter comes out. Chapter 2. The Cephalic Birth of Sir Rolando. Chapter 2 begins with the following epigram. One should avoid the impulse to begin each chapter with an ostentatious quote, for tedious long epigrams are kin to the extensive footnotes ancients wrote, but if such grandiosity is your wish, like prose-turned masturbatory solo jazz or a 20-minute song by the band Fish, then be advised the wiser author has no need to plunder dusty tomes to find some old academically approved words to pad out a novel too long to bind so it can be subdivided into thirds. Make the attribution from whole cloth. With care assure your lie cannot be checked. That way you needn't research a whole swath of books or make sure every word's correct. And for the God's sake, if you choose to start a tract with some broken sonnet, avoid a last couplet to hide the act. Garibald of Gaul, advisor to Julian the Apostate, Emperor of Byzantium, from a remaining scrap of Volume 7 of his series on writing marketable epic tales of chivalry in the modern style, 363 AD, kept in the very private collection of Ottoman Sultan Bayezid of Gazagirl, Turkey. When Benjamin Gorman arrived at the Portland International Airport, known to locals and airlines by the acronym PDX despite its failure to contain words beginning with D or X, one might be deceived into thinking some interesting story of his was just beginning. He trudged in awkward silence in a caravan of rolling carts behind his newly ex-wife and his stepdaughter, who carried their two cats in a pair of backpacks with plastic bubbles designed to give the cats something to look away from in feline disdain. His stepdaughter, they used they-them pronouns, but had recently favored presenting more femme and thus identified as Benjamin's stepdaughter, wore the two backpacks, one in the normal position on their back, the other reversed on their front, so they looked like some kind of spaceship piloted by an old white and gray cat in the cockpit, a much smaller and even more frail cat in the stern, and a human sandwiched in the middle. The dogs were just as eye-catching, if not more so. The two small dogs, referred to collectively as the puppies, despite being fully grown, were a mixture of a border collie and a Boston terrier, breeds whose sizes should have made them incompatible, and whose offspring were indisputably adorable but had not inherited the cleverness either breed is known for, replacing native intelligence with the bad judgment that had produced them. One example of this lack of discernment was that they felt a need to defend their big brother despite their inability to be intimidating, or his need for their defense. So if another dog came around, whoever walked the puppies had to keep them on a short leash and be prepared to yank them back when they leapt and barked. The third dog frightened some passers-by because, though he contained enough husky, German shepherd, and Malamute to make him legal to own as a pet, he was an 8th North American gray wolf and looked 100% that, right down to his gait, which looked less like a dog's trot than an apex predator slinking through a forest harrying a caribou. In truth, he was not only a gentle giant, but was afraid of most humans and terrified when too many congregated together. This caused him to weave back and forth on his longer leash, stepping over the small dogs trying to defend him as he drifted away from whichever toddler or octogenarian he currently considered most frightening. Still, people frequently stopped as humans to tell them how beautiful he was, and some men, always white and always in their 20s or 30s, would just reach out and attempt to pet him, revealing something about that demographic's understanding of consent. The dog would veer away, trying to get to some safe distance and yank on the arm of his owner. He had yet to bite a hand off, but Benjamin's newly ex-wife had frequently encouraged him to do so, just to teach these men a valuable lesson. The broken and despondent family made their way from the baggage area so the humans could smoke and the dogs could pee in their respective designated places. To passers-by, they were quite the sight, but one look at the humans' faces told everyone they were witnessing a mournful parade. Benjamin, for his part, stared off into the distance through wet eyes verging on tears, yet he couldn't bring himself to freely cry in public, though he knew it would be justified and appropriate in the circumstances. This is one of the many ways American masculinity constipates the soul. Not that Benjamin was some glaring example of masculinity. He wasn't much of an outlier in any way. Benjamin had once been strikingly mediocre. He owned a mid-priced house in a small town in Oregon, had driven a mid-priced middle-aged Honda CR-V, and had worked as a teacher at a mid-sized high school. He served as the president of his mid-sized local teachers union and on the state board, positions which may seem authoritative but are essentially volunteer gigs, mostly spent fielding complaints from people wise enough not to invest their time in the same way. But Benjamin had enjoyed the union work, the teaching, driving a car, and living in a house. He was frequently genuinely happy, and generally far too hopeful about the future. And then, in the course of a single year, he'd come to own 0 houses, drive 0 cars, fill 0 jobs, and hold 0 elected offices. His happiness and hopefulness, believe it or not, were still out of keeping with his circumstances, though on a scale of 0 to 100, there were a lot of zeros dragging down the average. Benjamin was 49 years old, nearly 100% broke, soon to be divorced for the second time, and about to leave his 3 dogs with his newly ex-wife and head off to live in his parents' basement in Cleveland, Ohio. And even in this condition, he wasn't extraordinary, since lots of people find themselves destitute, and many face tribulations which are far more noteworthy. Some people might be interested in the story of how all this came to pass, in the same way that a person might see a pigeon with a mangled leg and wonder if it had been attacked by a cat or dog or some larger bird. Wondering about the origin of the wound does not mean most of those people would have wanted to watch the incident or hear it described in any great detail. Some measure of explanation will be necessary later on, but more relevant to our purposes today was the effect. Benjamin's son had taken a day off work to come pick up his father, stepmother, and stepsister from the airport, along with their 3 dogs and 2 cats. From there, they would deliver the animals and 2 of the humans to their new apartment in Portland, and Benjamin would go on with his son to his son's house in Corvallis. As Benjamin loaded the suitcases into the trunk of his son's car, someone else emerged. Not from the trunk, and not literally from Benjamin's forehead. From Benjamin's perspective, the man stepped into the world through the large, slowly rotating door which kept the chill out of the warm airport but allowed people with large bags to roll in and out. From everyone else's perspective, nothing happened at all. And from our perspective, dear reader, this is the moment when Benjamin experienced what psychologists call structural dissociation, and what folklorists call a cephalic birth. Lord Rolando de Santa Maria del Pi of Barcelona stepped into the chilly air of a Portland January, tucked his cane under his arm, and turned up the collar of his black wool jacket. Only Benjamin could see that beneath the coat, the man wore something on top of a pair of black slacks and a gray sweater. Semi-transparent, even to Benjamin's eyes, the suit of armor glowed with a soft blue and green light, seeming to brighten as the man stepped from a beam of sunlight into another portion of shadow under the overpass for the arrival lanes, which were on the floor above. This armor didn't appear to be made of metal, and the fact that Benjamin could see the sweater and slacks through it was only part of the strangeness. The armor itself seemed to be made of bones, carefully selected and fitted together, then carved. For example, the portion covering Rolando's ribs looked like a rib cage, but with extra ribs fitted between the spaced ones found in a regular skeleton. And where a skeleton would hold only an absence between the rib cage and the pelvic bone, Rolando's armor had vertical bones, perhaps tibias or humeruses, laid in smooth strips running down to the waist. The pelvis itself looked nothing like a skeleton's, and the codpiece was a bit distended from where Rolando's slacks ended, a touch which may have seemed generous on the armorer's part, but, because the armor was transparent, served the opposite purpose. The thighs and shins were also covered in vertical bones, and the knees sported ornate caps much larger than those within a skeleton. Even Rolando's stylish leather shoes, which came to regular rounded toes, were covered by his bone armor and extended to sharp points in front and dangerous-looking spurs behind the heels. The armor also climbed above the collar of Rolando's sweater to a gorget running up to his jawline. He wore no helmet and didn't carry a semi-transparent shield of any kind, but Benjamin didn't notice these missing elements because he was too distracted by the raven on Rolando's shoulder. The creature looked like a skeleton, similar to Rolando's armor, but not filled in by extra bones, only it lacked a skull. Surrounding the skeleton, and showing clearly where the head would be, the same faint blue and green glow marked the locations of the creature's feathers, eyes, and beak. And it was no mere decoration. Benjamin could clearly see the semi-transparent head swiveling as it examined its surroundings, and the skeletal wings fluttered when it needed to maintain its balance on the older man's moving shoulder. The bird, though lacking a skull inside its semi-transparent body, was as motile as the solid man carrying it. The human brain files moving things under alive, despite the fact that everything in the universe is moving relative to everything else, and a stationary tree is far more alive than, say, the floating corpse of a whale. So Benjamin incorrectly determined the bird was alive when it was, in fact, both a ghost and part of his hallucination. Above the gorget and next to the ghostly raven, Rolando's thick, straight hair, mostly gray, still had some streaks of black, and his short beard, which came to a sharp point beneath his chin, also carried some speckles from his non-existent younger days. Unlike Benjamin, who wore glasses, Rolando's eyes were still sharp as ever, though both men had deep crow's feet. On Benjamin they looked pinched and telegraphed his anxiety. Rolando, on the other hand, looked jolly, like a painting of Santa Claus if the old elf were thin and demanding instead of plump and giving. Rolando carried no suitcase, his heavy coat and cane his only accessories with any physical density. Pulling the cane out from under his arm, he held it beneath the head, and Benjamin saw it bore the skull of a raven with its beak pointed down along the length of the rod of some dark burnished metal. Benjamin couldn't be sure of this, but the narrator can tell you he was correct in his assumption. This was the skull of the very ghost raven perched on the man's shoulder. Holding the head of the cane aloft like a lantern, Rolando whispered some magic words he'd learned from a Berber hermit wizard in Tunisia. The spell called upon the right kind of aid to show up at the right time. The caster didn't know what that right kind of aid would be, or whether the time was truly the right time, so Rolando took it on faith that the spell was useful and the results weren't merely coincidental. A more cynical person might have suspected the Berber wizard had been selling something ineffectual, quite a scam since Rolando paid handsomely for the magic words. But Rolando was not that kind of skeptic. He used the words sparingly, but almost always muttered them when hailing a cab, rickshaw, tuk-tuk, limousine, camel, elephant, or some other conveyance for hire. If the ride showed up, it reaffirmed his belief that the spell worked. If it did not, well, that meant Rolando should not wait over long, since a ride was obviously not the kind of help he needed. So the spell saved him time and stress. Benjamin stood in stupefaction, his hand hovering 6 inches from his face, the last of his cigarette burning to a long string of ash, until his son waved a hand in front of his eyes. "Dad? Hello? You there?" his son asked, mostly concerned that the car was parked in a space of questionable legality and would start getting honked at if they didn't finish loading the suitcases and dog crates quickly. Benjamin shook his head back and forth, trying to dislodge the vision of the man, but found when he sought him again, Rolando still stood there on the sidewalk, holding his cane aloft. "Just saw a very weird-looking person," Benjamin said. "Welcome back to Oregon," his son said, and Benjamin decided not to explain that Barcelona had plenty of the same kind of strangeness one might find on the streets of Portland, and a whole lot more diversity besides. Instead, not feeling comfortable acknowledging the sight of a man bedecked in glowing bone armor, Benjamin got back to work loading the car. But when he finally took his seat, he turned and looked back, trying to catch a glimpse of the stranger before they drove away. If Rolando's employment of the Berber spell had any effect at all, it attracted the cab driven by Sergio Sanchez, who noticed the dapper man holding a cane in the air and standing where fares always stood outside the airport. Serge, as his friends called him, could not see the bone armor or the ghost of a raven perched on the man's shoulder. He just saw a potential fare. Serge had been driving for Uber for more than a year. He'd previously delivered pizzas, beginning during his only and unfinished year of community college. After a couple years at Pizza Hut, he'd begun to deliver humans as well, since the Uber gig paid better, and he didn't have to deal with the irregular hours offered by his petty boss at Pizza Hut. That manager used the work schedule as a mechanism to reward and punish his underlings for perceived slights, like laughing too quietly or too loudly at his jokes. The employees spent their breaks reviewing interactions with the manager, trying to guess if they'd pleased or upset him, wondering what their schedules might look like the next time he posted the calendar on the wall. Serge hated it, so once he was sure the Uber thing was a better deal, he'd given his notice effective immediately and absconded with 3 pizzas he was meant to deliver. In the intervening months, he'd spent most of his working hours shuttling between the airport and downtown or the burbs, with a rare long fare as far south as Salem or as far north as Longview. He wasn't supposed to take people who were hailing cabs. Uber frowned on the practice, and it really was safer for him if he had some sense of the rider's destination and track record of paying their bills. But something about the man with the cane told Serge the ride would be long and quiet, and the tip would be exceptional. This would turn out to be wrong, an understatement, and correct in a way he couldn't have imagined, but not in that order. Serge pulled his red 2008 Toyota Corolla to the curb and stepped out, careful not to open the door too widely into traffic, but quickly enough to show he was Johnny on the spot. The fare looked remarkably like the most interesting man in the world in the Dos Equis commercials, who said, "I don't always drink beer, but when I do, I prefer Dos Equis," and signed off with, "Stay thirsty, my friends." Serge said, "Need a cab?" Rolando expected people to greet him with a stiff but courteous bow befitting his station, and he was always a bit peeved when they failed to do so. Consequently, he greeted most people with a brief, almost imperceptible frown of disappointment. Though they had no idea why, this produced a beneficial effect. Even subconsciously, it inclined them to want to impress this gentleman, who seemed to have given them a once-over and found them wanting. This was quite the opposite of Benjamin, who tried to greet everyone with an overly generous, arguably shit-eating grin which made them question his intelligence. "Sirrah," Rolando said, "I require more than mere conveyance. Tell me, what is your name?" "Sergio Sanchez, but my friends call me Serge." "I will not presume that level of familiarity, Sirrah Sanchez. I am Lord Rolando de Santa Maria del Pi of Barcelona, but you may call me Sir Rolando. I am in the market for a chauffeur, a footman, a butler, a secretary, and an esquire. Ideally, these positions would be occupied by 5 different people, but since I am traveling light on this quest, I am willing to pay a single individual the salaries of 5, assuming he proves capable of performing all these tasks. Would you like to earn the salaries of 5 people at once, Senor Sanchez? Serge did some quick mental math. Even at Oregon's minimum wage, he'd far exceed his Uber salary. What kind of time commitment are we talking about here? I am willing to see this quest through to its conclusion, whatever that may be. Seeing as it's January, it would be quite poetic if I should be able to reach a satisfactory conclusion in 1 year's time, perhaps by next Christmas. Then the tale of my great deeds would qualify as a Christmas story, and those are more likely to become traditions which are repeated annually. It would also be fitting if it should conclude in the summer, I suppose, or by the spring, or in a single day. Some great tales take place in a single day. That would be convenient for the reader, but also somewhat exhausting for us, the main characters. Regardless, I will not expect a squire to enter into the final battle and sacrifice himself for the sake of my honor, so I suppose you could serve as long as you are willing, and I am disposed to retain you. Serge felt a hint of hesitation at the mention of a year, then warmed to a day, then caught this hint of a threat at the end and recognized he might be blowing a big fare by asking too many questions, so he decided to play the role of a job interviewee desperate to please the new boss. Sounds good to me, Sir Rolando. Hop in and point the way. Excellent, my good man. Let us sally forth, and I shall describe the quest en route. Serge wasn't entirely sure what this meant or how to respond. Any bags, Sir Rolando? Only my cane, my companion Poe here, and the contents of my jacket. He frowned and softened his voice. Before I climb into your wagon, decorum dictates that I ask specifically for your permission to bring my raven inside. Though he is quite fleet, and if we are ever separated, he can find me due to our supernatural connection, he would have great difficulty flying at the same speed as your horseless carriage. I assure you he will not sully the interior by defecating or urinating inside, since he left those bodily functions behind when he concluded his existence as a creature of flesh and blood. Serge didn't understand what the man was talking about, and he expressed this with an eloquent, "What?" My bird will not shit in your car. May I bring him inside with me? Serge saw the skull on the top of Rolando's cane and thought the man was making a joke in a very dry way. He assumed incorrectly that the cane's name was a reference to Edgar Allan Poe, though this was closer than he could have known, since the famous American writer's name may have derived from the common Catalan name Poe. Serge chuckled and said, "Of course," slid under the wheel and closed his door. Rolando settled into the passenger seat and swung his door shut. I prefer to start my journeys carrying as little as possible. In my experience, one acquires objects on these quests, magical weapons and the like. They can get quite heavy, and carrying certain items can make a quest too easy. For example, I pack a few potions of healing, but I intentionally leave my potions of greater healing and my scrolls of revivify at home in Barcelona. There wouldn't be much of a challenge if I could simply heal any wound I might suffer, or bring myself back from death in an instant, would there? If they turn out to be necessary later on, as I expect they will on a quest such as this, I will find them along the way. Or they won't, and that will make the tale of my great deeds all the more impressive. I have my cane, my wits, Poe, my armor, and what I am carrying in my pockets. He held up his hands, upon which he wore 3 rings, one on each index finger and one on the ring finger of his right. Even these are not magical. If I find magic rings, I will give these to you, and if I find more than I can wear, I will trade them out, and you may acquire some magical rings on our journey as well. Serge put the car in gear and said, I'm not much of a rings guy. He pulled out of the space and started away. Benjamin managed to catch sight of Serge's red Toyota just as his son began to merge into the same traffic, but he lost his line of sight on the strange man in the bone armor amidst the cars, and he would not see Rolando again for some time. Because of the high, stiff collar of the ghostly armor, which Serge couldn't see, Rolando could barely turn his head in the driver's direction, but he swiveled and inclined it as much as he could as he said, "Then we will endeavor to find you a ring which can increase your charisma, such that you feel comfortable becoming a rings guy." Rolando pulled the latch on the glove compartment. "Perhaps there is one in here. They turn up wherever you least expect them." Serge began, then couldn't think of a polite way to tell a total stranger not to look in his glove compartment. If he'd had anything he'd worried about in there, he would have chosen to be impolite, but he couldn't remember the contents and didn't know of anything of concern. Rolando found the driver's manual, the receipts from oil changes, a cardboard book of matches, and a deck of playing cards. He held up the deck of cards and the matchbook. "Are either of these magical to the best of your knowledge?" The book of matches advertised a bar owned by an old friend of Serge's from high school. The logo had a gold-embossed image of a silhouette of a sexy mermaid. The bar's owner had always laughed about the logo in a lascivious way, which made Serge uncomfortable. The mermaid's nudity was only revealed by a tiny bit of gold marking one nipple, but that was enough for the bar's owner to fantasize. Serge had never understood this on the grounds of incompatible anatomy, but he'd laughed along to keep his friend from explaining it in detail. The bar hadn't made it, but the matches persisted. Serge shook his head. Just matches and cards. Rolando put the cards back, then stuck the matches into the interior pocket of his coat. Patting it, he said, "Potentially useful." Serge frowned, and they rode in silence out of the airport proper and onto the uncreatively named Airport Way. "So, where are you headed?" "The quest. Yes, I said I would explain. Well, as I'm sure you've noticed, this land is cursed." "Cursed?" "Of course. Look at the evidence, Sir Sanchez. In only the last few years, you've suffered a plague, turned the highest offices over to its most petty criminals, and yet the general public wanders about in a daze. Just look at the people." He motioned out the window. No pedestrians were currently visible. "They act as though everything is normal, but all of them know something is deeply wrong. They just don't know exactly what it is. Which, of course, is exactly what one would expect in a cursed land." Rolando said cursed as two syllables, curse and ed, but only some of the time, like a character in a Shakespearean play written when people couldn't decide which pronunciation was proper, and the playwright took advantage of the wiggle room based on what fit the meter best. But Rolando did not speak in iambic pentameter. He simply chose the pronunciation based on a gut feeling. "And if that isn't evidence enough, have you ever been to the Denver airport? It has a sculpture of a demonic horse in front, gargoyles inside, and a mural depicting men in gas masks carrying machine guns. In an airport. Look it up. A clear sign of something nefarious and occult going on." Serge shook his head. "I've never been to Denver, but the pandemic was global, and politicians are always crooked. It doesn't mean the land is cursed." "It's a matter of degrees, my friend. There are always unseen forces vying for control, of course. Powers of good and evil, heroes and monsters doing battle, angels and demons, and powers beyond normal mortal comprehension. And of course these mix with human virtues and vices, hope and compassion, battling with greed and malice and the like. But when the plague came to your shores, look what happened. More than 1 million dead. What was the grand total in, say, New Zealand? Less than 4,000? And in a country of roughly equivalent population, just so we're comparing apples to apples, how many people live in your country?" Serge shrugged. I don't know, like 300 or 400 million? "Correct. Not as nearly as many as China or India, but roughly Indonesia and Brazil combined. And Indonesia had 16,000 COVID deaths. Brazil did very poorly, 700,000. But the U.S. has had more than 1.2 million. More than 10 times as many as Brazil and Indonesia together. And those two countries combined have a GDP of roughly 3.6 trillion of your US dollars. Yours is 10 times that. So how do you explain how the richest country would suffer so much more greatly in a plague than the people of Brazil and Indonesia? Even here, you have seen that the poor die at a much higher rate in a plague than the rich. So how did a rich country die at a higher rate than two poor countries? How do you explain that?" "Well, I'm not an expert in immunology," Serge tried. "It's a curse!" Rolando shouted. Serge wanted to argue this point, but they'd almost reached the interchange with I-205, so the choice of a destination was more pressing. "Okay, so where are we going? I have to go north or south right up here." He pointed to the signage. Rolando frowned. "Give me a second." "The exit is right here. I need to—" "South!" cried Rolando. So loudly, Serge turned the wheel too hard, rocking the car as it entered the right lane, then barely correcting in time for it to land its full weight on 4 wheels and settle into the turn lane. Rolando's volume did not upset Poe, but the jostling of the car set the raven flapping his wings and cawing loudly. Rolando held up his cane and spoke to the skull there. "Oh, be calm yourself, my friend Poe. A small wobble, nothing more." The raven on Rolando's shoulder obeyed, tucking his wings and staring straight forward with the spectral eyes in his skullless head. Serge couldn't see Poe's flapping or hear the corvid's cry, so he watched Rolando talk to himself using his cane as a microphone, and thought the old man was completely crazy. But he'd felt a slight gust of wind he couldn't explain and didn't want to investigate, so he didn't comment on it. Instead, he took a deep breath before speaking. "All right, but where are we going exactly?" "That's one of the challenges of a quest like this. We don't know where we're going, because we don't know the origin of the curse, now do we? We have to investigate. I suspected it would be in your political capital of Washington, D.C., but it did not take me long to realize the people there, even those who are ostensibly in control, don't know what is going on any more than anyone else. Worse, they do not care to find the source of the curse, because they see every bit of human misery as an opportunity to request more donations from their supporters. Disappointed in D.C., I went to your financial and cultural capital, New York, and found the people there understand it even less. I considered going to some of your great universities to see if your scholars might have some clues about the nature of the curse, but even the most cursory glance at their financial priorities show they are devoted to producing graduates who have studied the least important things. Imagine if you could train doctors to cure cancer, and you spent more of your vast wealth and institutional energy training people to move money from one account to another marginally more quickly than they moved it back and forth yesterday. How would you describe such an institution of supposed higher learning? I don't know, I guess. "Cursed!" Rolando shouted again. This time Serge was coming out of the on-ramp and onto the freeway, and though he wasn't expecting the shout, he wasn't startled in changing direction. And that's lucky, because that moment would have been particularly dangerous. "They are obviously subject to the same supernatural forces which are affecting the rest of the country. Some of my contacts told me they had suspicions about the Denver airport, but I couldn't find anything there which would explain that whole—" He waved his hands around. "What's the English word for it? Michigas. Yes, Michigas." I don't, Serge tried. "So I heard Portland is quite proud of its weirdness, and I thought I'd investigate here next. Do you know the cause of Portland's famous weirdness?" "Hipsters like to move here, but they don't like to be called hipsters." "Yes, very strange. But do you know why?" "Lots of creative-type jobs?" "Oh, and when it became a state, I don't remember what year it was, but I know it was on Valentine's Day, they wrote into the state constitution that it would be a whites-only state. In a state that already had lots of non-white people, so that's weird. But they took that out of the state constitution." "Well, that's good." "In 2002, and 29% of the people voted to keep it in there. So that's weird, but not in a keep Portland weird way, more of a there are still a lot of white supremacists in Oregon way." I don't know if that's the cause of the curse, but it might be related. Maybe it's ghosts." Rolando reached into his coat's inner pocket, where he deposited the matchbook he stole from Serge's glove compartment, and he retrieved a small black leather-bound notebook. Then he leaned uncomfortably close to Serge as he pulled a pen from his pocket. "It's not one of my current theories, but we should look into it." "Ghosts?" "Sure, of indigenous people or others killed or displaced by these white supremacists. Maybe ghosts are cursing the land." "They'd have every right to," Serge said. "Certainly, but it seems less plausible than my other theories." "What are those?" Rolando flipped the pages in his notebook. "It could be the work of a single witch, though that's unlikely, because they generally target individuals or small towns, not whole countries, and they are often blamed for things far outside their powers for purely sexist reasons." He turned another page. "Similarly, it could be an evil wizard, but this seems larger than any one wizard's power also. While witches are often blamed for things they don't do, wizards often try to take credit for things they can't do because of the same patriarchal imbalance." Rolando looked up from his notebook at Serge. "You know how men are. We're the worst." Serge shrugged and nodded. "I haven't heard of any wizard trying to claim credit for the curse in the United States," Rolando continued, "and I'm fairly certain one of them would have been bragging about it if he'd even been slightly involved." He flipped to the next page. "It could be an infestation of gremlins. They like to cause mayhem. Maybe if they have a spread in sufficient numbers, they could conceivably, collectively accomplish something on this scale." Rolando's Spanish accent was almost imperceptible, but when he said spread and scale, Serge heard a tiny hint of an E preceding the S. Though Serge was of Mexican descent, he barely spoke any Spanish and did so with a gringo accent that made his grandparents wince. "But gremlins, well, their malicious acts tend to be cuter, and are accompanied by a kind of sinister sniggering people can sometimes pick up on. Have you heard of anyone talking about hearing the sound of whispered laughter?" Serge shook his head. "Not that I can—" "No, and there doesn't seem to be much to laugh at in this curse, does there? Still, it's a possibility worth exploring. But I do not believe it's gremlins. Unlikely." He turned to the next page. Now this is my most promising theory. Bone fairies." "Fairies? Bone fairies?" "Exactly. You've heard of them, of course." "No, never." "The tooth fairy? You must have heard of tooth fairies." "Just the one." "Of course there are many," Rolando said. "Just one to collect all those teeth? That wouldn't make any sense. There are many of them. Tooth fairies are the kindest of the bone fairies, because they only collect bones which have fallen out naturally. And even this they feel guilty about. It is a compulsion, and they are ashamed. That is why they leave money. They feel bad. Paying money makes them feel that they have purchased the tooth. They still don't like to admit they do it. You don't meet a tooth fairy at a party and hear them say, 'What do? Oh, I am a tooth fairy. I collect children's tiny teeth after they fall out of their little heads. I keep them, but I pay them, so it's not weird.'" "It is weird," Serge said. Right? Very strange. But there are bone fairies who prefer femurs, or hip bones, or skulls, and this particular curse seems to be moving towards a place where large numbers of bones might be gathered for them in conveniently shallow mass graves. That's pretty grim. Agreed. Something must be done. He snapped the little book closed and returned it to its pocket. Now, if the curse on the United States is caused by bone fairies, it shows more planning and subterfuge and patience than they've used in the past. But this all, he waved his hands at the world outside the car windows, does neatly fit with their goals. If you wanted to collect, say, human femurs, how would you go about it? Serge felt a deep disquiet having Rolando in his car. I wouldn't. Of course not, neither would I. But if a person did, think what they would do. Plague, civil strife, pitting people against one another, rounding up ever-increasing numbers of people who could then be quietly disappeared. And then, femurs, or whatever bones they want. It makes logical sense. Collecting bones isn't logical. No, not that part, that's true. And most bone fairies don't even feel tooth fairies' guilt about their strange compulsion. They don't brag about it at parties, but that's because they aren't invited. Who would invite someone to a party who would say, "Oh, what do? I collect human tibias, and I love it. Let me tell you all about it for a half an hour and follow you to the hors d'oeuvres table and on to the kitchen until you have to excuse yourself to the bathroom just to escape my company." No, no one wants those bone fairies at a party. Okay, Serge said. Now, I'm not saying I believe in bone fairies, but you're the boss and you're cutting the check, so I'll drive you wherever you need to go. And serve as a footman and butler and esquire and secretary, Rolando reminded him. Serge didn't know what any of those jobs entailed. He thought he knew what butlers did, but he was wrong, and he thought he knew what secretaries did, but his conception of a receptionist at a doctor's office was a far cry from what Rolando meant. The old gentleman would have been better served to refer to the position as an aide-de-camp or an adjunct. At least that way, Serge would have been aware that he didn't know what 3 of the 4 jobs required of him. Sure, he said, all those things too, but to do the first job as your driver... I prefer chauffeur, but go on, Rolando said. I need to know where to take you to find these bone fairies. Very true and sensible, my good man. May I see your mapping device? Before Serge could protest, Rolando reached up and grabbed the phone from its magnetic cradle above the dash. Blast, I seem to have made the map go away. Click on the one that says Maps, Serge advised, then wondered why he was telling this stranger how to use his phone. Ah, yes, and there we are, moving down this road here. If I look ahead of us... Drat, I seem to have misplaced us. Where are we again? You can zoom in and out with 2 fingers, like Serge held up a claw of 2 fingers and pinched them in and out like chopsticks. Ah, yes, Rolando said, trying and zooming in to an empty space on the map, then out to include all of Oregon and Washington and Idaho, much of California and British Columbia, and a sizable chunk of the Pacific. Taking his bearings, he rediscovered Oregon, then Portland, then pinched his way to the area they were headed. What about this weed? That sounds creepy. It's not. Basically a truck stop with a name that makes it a mecca for potheads, and it's like 6 or 7 hours away. Ugh, your American distances. That's further than a trip from Barcelona to Toulouse, France. We can go through 3 countries in the time it takes to leave your state. Footnote. This is technically true, but one of those countries is Andorra, the 16th smallest country in the world, with a landmass of 181 square miles and the 11th smallest by population, most of whom are on its Olympic team. So look for them, the 4th in alphabetical order, at the next opening ceremonies. What about this Corvallis? He pronounced the double L as a Y, put the accent on the last syllable, and made the city sound far fancier. Corvallis, Serge corrected, an hour and a half. All right, we begin our search in Corvallis. Rolando wasn't sure where he'd find the Bone Fairies' headquarters or how he'd disrupt their grand plan, but he knew he was the one for the job. Unlike Benjamin's misplaced confidence, which had led to his present circumstances, Rolando's confidence was an asset which tended to lead him in the right direction. Rolando's choice to go to Corvallis wasn't truly motivated by his own gut feeling. He had no intestines, which could inform his judgment because he didn't really exist. Rolando chose Corvallis, Oregon, because that's where Benjamin would spend a couple of nights, sleeping on a couch in his son's house, doing his best to be unobtrusive to his son's roommates who were generous enough to acquiesce to his presence. But while Benjamin was there, Rolando would find his first significant clue about the origin of the curse he sought to lift. But first, Rolando would do battle with a giant. And that will occur in Chapter 3. If you're excited about this project, please subscribe on YouTube or like and share on TikTok or Reels or whatever app you're on now. And if you're willing to support me as I craft this novel in serial form, please consider supporting my Substack or Patreon. Each week I'll give a shout out to some of those patrons. This week I'm thanking Patreon patrons Bree, Jim76, Vidal Peña, and Karen Eisenbray, author of the Tales from Deep River series. Thank you all for your continued support. In the future, in addition to thanking patrons, I'd like to get back to running ads to support other authors and creatives. So if you have something to plug, please email NotAPipePublishing at NotAPipePublishing@gmail.com. See you back here next week for Chapter 3 of Tilting at Windmills.